A struggling single mother's desperate fight for justice against an unjust system leads to shocking revelations about her family and the truth behind the biased rulings in her case. Will her courage and determination bring her the justice she seeks? Or will the system silence her once again? Stick around to find out, and don't forget to share where you're watching from in the comments. Sharon Willis stood outside the courtroom, her palms damp and her stomach churning. She smoothed the wrinkles on her thrifted blazer, an effort to steady herself for what was to come. The weight of this day pressed on her like a boulder. The stakes were painfully clear. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was her family's survival on the line. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with activity. Lawyers strode purposefully through the halls, clerks shuffled papers, and the quiet murmur of conversations filled the air. For Sharon, the atmosphere was suffocating, a stark reminder of how alien this world was to her. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be at work, serving coffee and eggs to the early morning crowd at Ed's diner. She glanced down at her phone. A text from her sister lit up the screen. "You got this, Shar. Stay strong for Toby." Toby. Just thinking about her son's face made her chest tighten. His laughter, his bright smile, his soft voice saying, "It's okay, Mom, we'll figure it out." It was all she needed to keep fighting. Willis called a bailiff, snapping Sharon back to reality. She took a deep breath, clutched her folder of documents, and stepped into the courtroom. The room felt cold, sterile, almost hostile. Sharon's heart raced as she approached the plaintiff's table. Across the room sat Barry Reynolds, her landlord. He was a stout, balding man in his late 50s wearing an expensive suit that screamed arrogance. His smug smirk was unbearable, as if he already knew the outcome of today's proceedings. Sharon's pro bono attorney, Reggie Harris, leaned in and whispered, "Just stick to the facts, don't let him rattle you." Sharon nodded. Reggie's confidence was reassuring, but it didn't erase her fear. This wasn't a fair fight. Reynolds had a team of high-priced lawyers at his side, while Sharon only had Reggie, a community advocate fresh out of law school. Still, he was all she could afford, and he believed in her case, which meant the world. Judge Harold Simons entered the room, and everyone rose. Simons was an older man with a sharp, scrutinizing gaze and an air of impatience. He settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, and called the room to order. "Let's proceed," he said, his voice flat. Reggie stood, presenting their argument. "Your Honor, my client, Ms. Willis, is bringing this case against Mr. Reynolds for unlawful eviction. The landlord shut off utilities, including water and heat, in the middle of winter, forcing my client and her disabled son to leave the premises. This is not only illegal, but inhumane." Judge Simons glanced down at his papers, barely acknowledging Reggie's words. "Mr. Reynolds, you have a response?" Barry Reynolds, lead attorney, a polished man named Mr. Givens, rose smoothly. "Your Honor, the defense asserts that my client acted within his rights. Ms. Willis was delinquent on her rent for months. While we sympathize with her situation, the law is clear. If rent isn't paid, eviction proceedings are justified." "Sympathize," Sharon blurted out, unable to contain herself. "You shut off the heat during a snowstorm. My son, he's in a wheelchair. Do you have any idea—" "Ms. Willis," Judge Simons interrupted, his tone clipped. "You will address the court through your attorney." Sharon's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she sank back into her seat. Reggie gave her a small nod, urging her to stay calm. "Your Honor," Reggie continued, "the issue isn't whether rent was owed. The issue is that Mr. Reynolds took illegal actions to force my client out of her home without due process. We have evidence that utilities were deliberately cut off, including emails between Mr. Reynolds and his property manager." He handed a stack of papers to the bailiff, who delivered them to the judge. Judge Simons flipped through the documents, his expression unreadable. "This doesn't prove intent," he said dismissively, setting the papers aside. "It could just as easily be a maintenance issue." "But, Your Honor," Reggie began. "Enough," Simons said sharply. He turned to Barry Reynolds. "Did you cut off the utilities?" Reynolds shook his head, feigning innocence. "No, Your Honor. The building is old. Things break down. Simons nodded, as if satisfied with the answer. Sharon's jaw dropped. She could feel her pulse pounding in her temples. How could the judge ignore the evidence so easily? "Miss Willis," Simon said, addressing her directly, "I understand your frustration, but without concrete proof of wrongdoing, this court cannot proceed. Case dismissed." The words hit Sharon like a punch to the gut. Dismissed. Just like that, her case, the truth, was thrown out. She felt a surge of anger and despair welling up inside her, but she bit her tongue. Crying or shouting wouldn't help. She had already been humiliated enough. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the proceedings, Reynolds shot Sharon a triumphant grin before sauntering out of the courtroom with his lawyers in tow. Reggie placed a hand on Sharon's shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "We'll find another." But Sharon barely heard him. Her thoughts were racing, her vision blurred with tears she refused to shed in public. She grabbed her bag and left the courtroom as quickly as she could. Outside, the crisp air hit Sharon's face, grounding her. She leaned against a pillar, gripping her phone tightly. She wanted to scream, to cry, to do something, but instead she opened her text messages and stared at the last photo she had taken of Toby. He was grinning up at her, his wheelchair decorated with stickers of his favorite cartoon characters. That smile was her reason for everything. She thought about all the sacrifices she had made, working double shifts, skipping meals to stretch her grocery budget, lying awake at night worrying about Toby's future. And now this. The system had failed her. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a call from her sister, Erica. "How did it go?" Erica asked cautiously. "It didn't," Sharon replied, her voice hollow. "The judge dismissed it. He didn't even care." "That's ridiculous. You have evidence," Erica began. "It doesn't matter," Sharon said, cutting her off. "It's over." "No, it's not," Erica said firmly. "You can't give up. We'll figure this out together." Sharon sighed, grateful for her sister's support but unsure how to move forward. Her faith in the system had been shaken to its core. Still, deep down she knew Erica was right. She couldn't give up. Toby was counting on her. As she walked to the bus stop, Sharon's mind churned with ideas. She thought about her next steps, about the people who might be able to help her. She didn't know how, but she was determined to fight back. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for Toby, for every tenant who had been treated unfairly, and for the hope that justice still mattered. The days after the courtroom defeat were a blur of frustration and determination for Sharon. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Judge Simon's dismissive expression and Barry Reynolds' smug grin. Her defeat wasn't just a personal loss. It was an affront to every ounce of effort she had poured into protecting her son. The anger simmered in her chest, pushing her to act. It was a cold Tuesday morning when Sharon found herself sitting in the cramped office of Reggie Harris, her pro bono lawyer. Reggie's desk was cluttered with stacks of papers, law books, and an empty coffee cup with a faint lipstick stain that wasn't his. Sharon was seated across from him, fidgeting with the zipper of her worn jacket. "This isn't over," Reggie said, his tone firm. "I know we didn't get the outcome we wanted, but that doesn't mean we stop here." Sharon raised an eyebrow. "Reggie, the judge dismissed the case. How do we fight something that doesn't even exist anymore?" "We appeal," Reggie replied, leaning forward. "Or better yet, we dig deeper. We need to figure out why Simons dismissed your case so quickly. His reaction wasn't just bias. It felt deliberate." Sharon frowned. "You think something's going on?" Reggie nodded. "Simons has a reputation for siding with landlords in these cases. It's almost a pattern. I've been looking into some of his previous rulings, and they're—" Sharon felt a flicker of hope. "What do you mean?" "Let me show you." Reggie swiveled his laptop around to face her. On the screen was a spreadsheet of cases Judge Simons had presided over. Reggie pointed to a highlighted row. "This is your case. Now look at these." He scrolled through dozens of cases, each marked with the landlord's name, the tenant's name, and the outcome. a chilling trend emerged. Simons consistently ruled in favor of landlords, even when evidence clearly supported the tenants. "It's like he's protecting them," Sharon said, her voice trembling with a mix of outrage and disbelief. "Why would a judge do that?" "That's the question," Reggie said, "and we're going to find the answer." The next week was a whirlwind of research, meetings, and late nights. Reggie worked tirelessly, poring over court records and legal documents, while Sharon focused on gathering more evidence against Barry Reynolds. She visited former tenants who had faced similar treatment, documenting their stories and collecting affidavits. Many were reluctant to speak out, fearing retaliation, but a few brave souls stepped forward, their voices cracking with emotion as they recounted their experiences. One tenant, Mrs. Gonzalez, an elderly woman who had lived in Reynolds' building for over 20 years, spoke through tears about how she had been forced to move out after her rent mysteriously tripled overnight. Another tenant, a single father named Jamal, described how Reynolds had threatened him with eviction if he didn't pay for repairs that were supposed to be the landlord's responsibility. "These people deserve justice," Sharon said to Reggie one evening as they sifted through the growing pile of evidence in his office. "We all do." Reggie looked at her, admiration in his eyes. "You're doing something incredible, Sharon. This isn't just about your case anymore. It's about standing up to the whole system." Sharon nodded, but the weight of the responsibility was heavy. "I just hope it's enough." The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Sharon was scrolling through online forums about tenant rights when she stumbled across a post mentioning Barry Reynolds. The user, anonymous but clearly well-informed, claimed Reynolds had a cozy relationship with several local officials, including judges. They even hinted at bribes being exchanged to secure favorable rulings. Sharon's heart raced as she screenshot the post and sent it to Reggie. "This could be it," she said when they met the next morning. "If Reynolds is bribing officials, including Simons, that explains everything." "It's a start," Reggie said cautiously. "But we need proof. Allegations alone won't hold up in court." Their investigation led them to a whistleblower, an employee at Reynolds' property management company, who agreed to meet them in secret. The whistleblower, a nervous young woman named Angie, shared damning details about Reynolds' operations. She described how Reynolds used shell companies to funnel money and how he boasted about having friends in high places. "I don't know if Judge Simons is one of them," Angie admitted. "But Reynolds talks about him like they're best friends. He says Simons owes him favors." Reggie recorded Angie's testimony and thanked her for her courage. "This is huge," he told Sharon later. "If we can connect the dots, we might be able to expose Reynolds and Simons both." As their case gained momentum, Sharon's story began to spread. A local journalist picked up on her fight and wrote a piece highlighting the injustice she had faced. The article went viral, and soon Sharon was flooded with messages of support and outrage. Strangers offered donations to help with her legal fees, while activists organized rallies outside the courthouse demanding accountability. One of those rallies caught the attention of someone Sharon never expected to hear from, her estranged father, Kenneth Willis. Sharon hadn't spoken to him in over a decade, not since he walked out on their family when she was a teenager. She had grown up resenting him, but when he called out of the blue, she wasn't sure how to feel. "Sharon," Kenneth said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I saw your story on the news. I want to help." Sharon hesitated. "Why now? After all these years, why do you suddenly care?" Kenneth sighed. "Because I made mistakes and I can't change the past. But I can do something now. I'm a retired judge, Sharon. I know the system, and I know how to fight it." His words hung in the air, a mixture of sincerity and regret. Sharon didn't trust him, not yet, but she couldn't afford to turn down his help. "Okay," she said cautiously. "What do you have in mind?" Kenneth offered to testify against Simons, using his knowledge of judicial ethics to expose the corruption Sharon and Reggie had uncovered. It was a risky move, one that could ruin Kenneth's reputation, but he insisted it was the right thing to do. The day of the appeal hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Sharon sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Reggie and Kenneth. Across the aisle, Barry Reynolds looked uneasy for the first time, his smug demeanor replaced by a nervous twitch in his jaw. Reggie presented their new evidence, including Angie's testimony and financial records linking Reynolds to Judge Simons. Kenneth took the stand, delivering a scathing critique of Simons' conduct and outlining the ethical violations he had committed. The courtroom was silent as Kenneth concluded his testimony. "Judges are meant to uphold justice," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "When they betray that duty, they undermine the very foundation of our society." As the judge presiding over the appeal reviewed the evidence, Sharon felt a spark of hope. For the first time, she believed the truth might finally prevail. The tension in the courtroom was electric. Sharon sat perfectly still, her hands folded tightly in her lap as the judge, presiding over her appeal, deliberated. The weight of months of effort, sleepless nights, and raw determination hung in the balance. Across the room, Barry Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his once confident smirk now replaced with a nervous fidget. The courtroom's air buzzed with the quiet murmurs of onlookers, reporters, and supporters who had come to witness the final showdown. The judge, a composed and meticulous woman named Judge Emily Carter, finally raised her gavel, calling the room to order. Her gaze was sharp as it swept the courtroom, pausing briefly on Sharon before settling on the defendant's table. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented during the appeal," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "And it is the opinion of this court that serious ethical violations have occurred." Sharon inhaled sharply, her heart pounding in her chest. She stole a glance at Reggie, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. Next to him, her father Kenneth sat stoically, his hands folded but his expression betraying a mix of pride and regret. Judge Carter continued, her tone unwavering. "The evidence provided by Ms. Willis and her legal counsel reveals a disturbing pattern of corruption involving the defendant, Mr. Barry Reynolds, and Judge Harold Simons. Financial records indicate improper payments, while witness testimony supports claims of collusion to unfairly dismiss cases in favor of Mr. Reynolds." The courtroom erupted in a collective gasp. Sharon could hardly believe her ears. All the struggle, all the humiliation. It was finally being validated. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, but quickly brushed it away. She had to stay strong, not just for herself, but for Toby and the countless others who had been wronged by the system. Judge Carter's expression hardened as she addressed Reynolds. "Mr. Reynolds, your blatant disregard for the law and exploitation of your tenants will not go unpunished. This court orders an immediate audit of all properties under your management, and I am recommending criminal charges be filed against you." Reynolds stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Your Honor, this is outrageous," he bellowed, but his voice cracked under the pressure. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, urging him to sit down, but Reynolds was unraveling. "You have no proof that I—" "Reynolds," Judge Carter interrupted, her voice rising. "You are out of order. Sit down, or I will hold you in contempt of court." Reynolds hesitated before collapsing into his chair, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. Sharon felt a wave of satisfaction watching the man who had tormented her finally brought to heel. Judge Carter then turned her attention to Sharon. Her voice softened, losing its authoritative edge. "Mrs. Willis, your perseverance in the face of adversity is commendable. This court recognizes the hardships you have endured and the courage you've shown in pursuing justice. It is my ruling that the eviction was unlawful. The defendant is ordered to compensate Ms. Willis for damages, including emotional distress, and to cover all legal fees." Sharon exhaled in relief, her shoulders sagging as the tension drained from her body. She turned to Reggie, who was grinning ear to ear, and then to her father, who gave her a small, approving nod.
Thank you,"
Sharon whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was thanking the judge, Reggie, her father, or some higher power. Maybe all of them. The gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, but Sharon's fight wasn't over yet. As the courtroom emptied, Sharon was swarmed by reporters and supporters. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in her face, and voices clamored for her attention. "Mrs. Willis, how does it feel to finally win? What's next for you? Do you have any words for other tenants facing similar situations?" Sharon raised her hands to quiet the crowd. She took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the chaos. "This victory isn't just for me. It's for every tenant who's ever been silenced, ignored, or treated unfairly. The fight isn't over until we have a system that works for everyone, not just those with money and power." The crowd erupted in applause, and Sharon felt a surge of hope. This was bigger than her now. It was a movement, a chance to create lasting change. Later that evening, Sharon returned home to her small apartment, where Toby was waiting. His face lit up as she walked through the door. "Mom, did we win?" he asked eagerly, wheeling himself toward her. Sharon crouched down to hug him, tears streaming freely now. "Yes, baby, we won." Toby beamed, his smile wide and bright. "Does this mean we get to stay here?" "For now," Sharon said, brushing his hair back. "But it also means something more important. It means people are going to listen to us now. We made them listen." Toby nodded solemnly, as if understanding the gravity of her words. "You're awesome, Mom." Sharon laughed, holding him close. "No, Toby, we're awesome." In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of Sharon's case spread far and wide. Judge Simons was suspended pending an investigation into his conduct, and Barry Reynolds faced criminal charges for fraud and unethical business practices. Other tenants who had been wronged by Reynolds began coming forward, emboldened by Sharon's courage. Sharon also found herself in an unexpected new role, an advocate for housing justice. She was invited to speak at rallies and forums, sharing her story and pushing for reforms to protect tenants from predatory landlords. Her relationship with her father, Kenneth, also began to heal. Though their history was fraught with pain, their shared fight for justice created a foundation for reconciliation. Kenneth apologized for the years he had been absent, and while Sharon wasn't ready to fully forgive him, she appreciated his willingness to make amends. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Kenneth placed a hand on Sharon's shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You've done something incredible." Sharon smiled, her eyes meeting his. "We did it together." Months later, Sharon stood at the podium of a crowded auditorium, her voice ringing with confidence as she addressed an audience of tenants, advocates, and lawmakers. "This isn't just about housing," she said. "It's about dignity. It's about creating a world where no one has to fight this hard just to be heard. We have the power to change that. Together." The audience erupted in applause, and Sharon felt a swell of pride. She had started this journey as a struggling single mother fighting for her family's survival. Now, she was a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of resilience and hope. As she stepped away from the podium, Toby wheeled himself onto the stage to meet her. He reached for her hand, and together they faced the cheering crowd. In that moment, Sharon knew their story wasn't just about hardship, it was about triumph. And this was only the beginning.